Have you ever thought about like when a new treatment, new drug or therapy comes out, how do we really know how it's going to affect people way down the line? Not just in like the next few weeks or months, but
Right.
like 5, 10, maybe even 20 years later,
Yeah, absolutely.
especially for those chronic conditions, the ones people live with for years.
Of course.
Or, when a medication's been on the market for a while and tons of people are taking it.
Right.
What happens then? You know? It's something I've definitely thought about a lot, and I bet you have too, if you're, into following medical news or if you or someone you know is dealing with a health issue.
Makes sense.
So that's what we're going to really get into today, the whole world of how we figure out the long-term impacts of these treatments.
Okay. Sounds good.
We're talking about patient registries and
Uh-huh.
long-term studies, those things that track what happens to people over time.
Yeah, those are really important tools.
They are super important. And you might kind of know what a registry is, but in the medical world, it's basically a way to gather all this data on patients who have the same condition or who've gotten a certain treatment.
Uh-huh.
It's like building this huge detailed record of what their health journey is like.
Right, like a long-term picture instead of just a snapshot.
Exactly. And they're designed to collect this info over a really long time.
Yeah.
So we can start to see those patterns and really understand how these treatments are affecting people in the real world.
Yeah. And way beyond what those initial clinical trials can tell us.
For sure. So today we're going to unpack how these registries are put together, how they work.
Yeah.
We'll look at the key parts of the design, how they collect data, and probably the most important thing, how they analyze all that data to give us insights into whether these treatments are really safe and effective over the long haul.
Yeah. That analysis part is crucial.
It is, for
And,
sure.
learning about all this, it's really relevant for everyone. It helps us understand how medical knowledge keeps growing and changing. It's not static.
Not at all.
It's always evolving as we learn more from what's happening out in the real world, and that means better health care for all of us.
Exactly. So let's jump right in.
Okay.
When we talk about, the big picture of medicine and how we learn about treatments,
Uh,
what's the fundamental reason these patient registries exist? What's that big need they fill?
well, at their core, they're meant for those long-term safety and outcome studies.
Okay.
So those early clinical trials, the phase 2 trials,
Mm.
they're super important.
Right.
They tell us a lot about how toxic a treatment might be and how the body reacts in the short term.
Okay.
But they often don't have the scope,
Yeah,
the size or the length of time to catch everything.
that makes sense.
Like, say there's a side effect that only pops up in a small number of patients,
Okay.
or maybe it takes years to develop.
Right.
Those early trials might totally miss it.
So like if it's a rare thing or something that takes a while to show up,
Exactly.
it could fly under the radar in those initial trials.
Exactly. And that's where registries come in.
Okay.
They're big,
Yeah.
and they go on for a long time, so they're really valuable.
Okay.
By tracking data from many more patients and for a longer time,
Mm-hmm.
and doing it in those everyday clinical settings,
Right.
we get a way better chance of finding those less common side effects, the ones that might not show up in a controlled trial.
So it's like casting a wider net and watching for longer.
Exactly.
And it's not only about spotting problems,
Right.
right? These registries also give us a much clearer picture of whether a treatment actually works in the long run outside of that controlled environment of a trial.
Yeah, you got it.
Because a treatment might look super effective in a trial
Yeah.
where everything is, really controlled and patients are carefully selected.
Yeah.
But then in the real world where people have other health issues or are taking other medications,
Yeah.
maybe they don't always follow the treatment plan perfectly.
Yeah, life happens.
Yeah.
Those registries show us how well the treatment really works over the long term.
in that messy real world.
Exactly.
So beyond safety and effectiveness, are there other insights we can get from this kind of long-term data collection?
Oh, for sure. We can learn a ton about how diseases naturally progress over time.
Oh, okay.
So say you have a registry for a certain autoimmune disease.
Okay.
Researchers can track how that disease changes in different people.
Yeah.
They can find things that might predict if someone will have a more severe case, or see how lifestyle choices affect the outcome.
So it's like putting together a super detailed timeline of the disease itself.
Yes.
And also how different treatments affect that timeline for a large group of people.
Exactly.
That's super cool. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about how these registries are actually designed.
Okay.
What are those essential pieces that go into making a really effective patient registry?
Right.
Like if you're starting from scratch and you want to build one of these massive data gathering systems, Where do you even begin?
Well, the very first thing you got to do is figure out exactly who's going to be in the registry. You got to set up really clear criteria
Mm-hmm.
for who can participate and who can't.
Yeah.
This is where you think carefully about the patients. You want to study their condition, the treatment they got, all that. Because this definition is what helps you account for other things that could be affecting the outcomes.
Okay.
Things like other health problems they might have or other treatments they're getting.
So you have to be super specific about who you're tracking to make sure that data you get is actually useful and that you can compare apples to apples.
Exactly. You said it perfectly.
So what specific info are they actually collecting from these patients?
Well, it depends on what the registry is trying to achieve.
Okay.
But generally, you'll see details about the treatment itself,
Like what?
like the exact medication or therapy,
Mm,
the dosage, how long they've been on it, that kind of thing.
got it.
They also collect important patient characteristics like age, gender,
Mm.
other conditions. They have
Yeah.
a medical history. And of course, a big focus is on tracking outcomes. How's their health changing their quality of life and any bad side effects they might be experiencing.
Makes sense.
And how often you collect this data.
Uh-huh.
That's another really important part of the design.
Okay, so this sounds like a ton of information to manage
Yeah, it could be a lot.
for potentially thousands of people over many years.
Right.
How do they even make sure all that data is accurate and consistent across everyone and over all that time?
That's a great question, and it's crucial to get it right.
Yeah.
So typically they use standardized forms for data collection, and they have very clear rules that everyone involved in entering that data has to follow.
Okay, that makes sense.
And we're seeing more and more digital tools being used to help with all this, things like apps and wearables.
Oh, yeah, those are getting popular.
They are, and they can really help patients report symptoms, track their medications, and send in other info directly.
So cutting out some of that manual data entry?
Yeah, and it probably helps with getting more frequent updates.
Yeah, I bet. But with this shift toward digital, what are some of the new challenges we have to think about?
Oh, that's a great point. As we start relying more on digital healthcare technologies, we got to make sure those old regulatory systems keep up.
Right.
Because even though these digital tools offer a lot of benefits, we need good ways to monitor them for safety and make sure they're actually working the way they should.
That makes sense.
So regulatory bodies are working hard with different groups to set standards and make sure everyone is accountable as this technology keeps developing.
It's like a whole new frontier.
It really is.
Okay, so you've got the registry set up, you're collecting tons of data.
Right.
Now what? How do you take all that raw info and turn it into something meaningful insights about long-term safety and how well these treatments are working?
That's where the analysis comes in, and it's a big job.
Huh?
You got to use some pretty sophisticated methods to handle all that data,
Uh-huh.
and it's complex data.
Okay.
So you need powerful statistical analysis
Right.
to spot trends and connections between treatments and outcomes and any signs of safety problems that might be popping up over time.
So you can't just look at the raw numbers.
Not at all.
You need these special statistical techniques to really dig in and find those hidden patterns.
Exactly. And analysts might compare different groups within the registry,
Like what call groups?
like people who got one treatment versus another.
Okay.
They're looking for differences that are statistically significant.
Uh-huh.
That could mean one group has a higher risk of side effects
Right.
or a better chance of a good outcome.
Okay.
And, analyzing data collected over many years comes with its own set of challenges.
Oh, yeah, I bet, like, what?
Well, one of the biggest is dealing with what we call confounding factors.
Okay.
These are other variables that could be influencing the outcomes,
Right.
making it tough to isolate the real effect of the treatment.
Okay, can give me an example of that?
Sure. So imagine one group in the registry happens to be a lot older,
Okay.
or they have more health problems to begin with.
Right.
Those factors could be affecting their outcomes, regardless of what treatment they're getting.
That makes sense.
So analysts have to use statistical adjustments to account for all this complexity.
So it's like untangling a big knot,
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
trying to separate the real impact of the treatment from everything else that could be going on.
Exactly.
Okay, so can you give us some real-world examples of how these registries are actually being used to help us understand long-term safety and how well treatments work?
Absolutely. Let's start with those registries for chronic diseases.
Okay.
These are super helpful for things like certain cancers or autoimmune disorders.
Right.
The ones people live with for years.
Yeah.
These registries track a lot of patients over a long period and document how their disease is changing, what treatments they're getting, and what their health outcomes are like over time.
So, for example, someone with a rare type of cancer.
Right.
A registry could pull data from patients across many different hospitals,
Mhm.
maybe even different countries.
Wow.
That would give researchers a way broader view than any single hospital could get on its own.
That's the idea. And it lets researchers spot factors that might influence how the disease progresses or
Yes.
how well someone responds to different therapies.
So it's like a global collaboration.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So what about after a medication has already gotten approval, from the FDA or whatever,
Right.
and it's available to everyone? How do registries contribute then?
That's where post-market drug monitoring comes in.
Okay.
And registries are a key part of that.
Okay.
Even after all those rigorous clinical trials, some side effects might not show up until the drug is being used by tons of people out in the real world.
So something that only affects a small percentage of people
Right.
or that takes a while to develop
Exactly.
might not show up until much later.
Exactly. And registries act as a kind of safety net
Okay.
to help us catch those unexpected issues.
So like if a few years after a new drug is released, a small group of people start having a certain side effect, a good registry could help spot that trend.
Absolutely. And that could lead to safety alerts, changes to how doctors prescribe the drug,
Okay.
or in some cases, if the risks are bigger than the benefits, the drug could even be pulled off the market.
So it really shows that we're always learning about the safety of medications,
Right.
even after they're out there.
It's an ongoing process.
What about this really complex treatments like biologics?
Ah, yes, biologics. They're a whole other ball game.
Yeah,
They're often derived from living organisms,
right.
and registries are especially important for tracking them in the long term.
Okay.
One thing we look at is immunogenicity.
Okay.
That's when the patient's body starts making an immune response against the drug,
Oh, wow.
and that can make the drug less effective or even cause bad reactions.
So the body is fighting the treatment.
In a way, yeah.
Wow.
And registries help us understand how often this happens and if it's a big problem clinically.
So with these biologics,
Mhm.
which are often really expensive.
Yeah. Registries help us make sure we understand their long-term effects,
Exactly.
including whether the body might eventually stop responding to them.
Yeah. And we also look for any other long-term effects that might come up because these molecules are complex.
Wow.
They interact with the body in a lot of different ways.
Right.
So keeping an eye on them through registries is super important.
Really important. Okay, so we've talked a lot about how these registries work and why they're important.
Yeah.
What do you see as some of the biggest benefits we've gotten from using them over the years?
Oh, there are a lot of benefits. I mean, first, like we talked about, they give us a much better overall understanding of how safe and effective treatments are in the real world.
Right, not just in a clinical trial.
Exactly. And they're super valuable for finding those rare side effects that might not show up in the early trials.
Right.
And they give us important clues about how diseases progress naturally over time and all the different things that can influence that.
And all of that feeds into how doctors make decisions about treatment. Absolutely. It helps them make more informed choices for their patients.
So, evidence-based medicine.
Exactly.
Now, have there been any big lessons learned about how to set up and use these registries most effectively?
Definitely one of the biggest is that you absolutely need high-quality data.
Makes sense.
If the info you're collecting is incomplete or inaccurate or inconsistent, then any analysis you do and any conclusions you draw from it won't be reliable.
Right, garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly. And getting patients involved is really important too.
Yeah.
You need people to be willing to participate and share their info over a long period.
Uh-huh.
So explaining the purpose of the registry clearly and making sure people have a good experience,
Right.
that's all essential. And the last thing we've learned is that these registries can't be static.
Okay.
They need to be flexible.
Right.
Sometimes you need to change the design or what data you're collecting as we learn more about the disease or the treatment.
So it's a constant process of improvement
It is.
to make sure these registries stay relevant. To wrap things up, can you just remind us why these patient registries and long-term studies are so crucial to moving healthcare forward?
They're really the foundation for making sure that treatments aren't just effective in the short term, but stay safe and beneficial for patients throughout their lives.
Right.
They give us that real-world evidence that adds to what we learn from clinical trials, so we get a much more complete picture of how these treatments impact people's lives.
It's amazing to think about all the data that's being collected and analyzed to make healthcare better.
It is.
It really shows how medicine is always learning and changing.
Absolutely, and it makes you think about the future, too.
Yeah, like what?
How might all these new technologies like digital health and artificial intelligence totally change how we use and learn from these registries?
Right.
We're already seeing the potential of AI, to analyze huge amounts of complex data, like genetic info and medical images, and even to predict what treatments might work best. So imagine what we could do if we combine these advanced technologies with all the rich long-term data from patient registries.
That's pretty exciting.
It is.
So for anyone listening who wants to learn more about this, I'd recommend checking out the resources from agencies like the US FDA.
Yeah, good idea.
They're the ones who approve new drugs and devices, and they keep track of safety once those things are on the market.
Right.
And their websites usually have a ton of info about drug safety and how they protect patients.
That's a great place to start.
So keep learning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure.
Likewise.
Until next time.
See you then.